don't need any sound for this. So a typical school lunch outside. This particular kid is alone. Now watch the bystander responses. And now. If that wasn't a demonstration of imbalance of power, that was getting at the very core. And did you notice the face of the bully afterwards? That was a rewarding experience. So I'm going to turn to talk about the kid on the ground, the flight of the victim. So first of all, who are the targets? What are some of the risk factors? What might be some of the protective factors a little bit later on? And what do we know about the effects? It turns out that although sometimes you look at these situations, and I've heard so many, seen so many, that sometimes it's really, really hard to figure out why on earth did that kid become the victim. Most of the time, however, it turns out to be a kid with no friends. And that's why we have such correspondence between, the data that Tina mentioned, between kids with special needs being prime targets. Because they often, in included mainstream settings, are the ones who are lacking that friend. But we also know that any deviation from the norm increases the risk of getting bullied. Now, so I'm not from Norway, but I'm from Finland, and Norway, Finland, and Sweden actually are very much alike in terms of being very, very homogeneous societies. Actually, Finland still remains as such, whereas Norway and Sweden are getting a little bit more heterogeneous in terms of what kids look like. So most kids have blonde hair and blue eyes. So what's really interesting about this is that in societies where there's very little heterogeneity, where we're talking about homogeneous populations, bullying was recognized already in 1960s as a major problem. Similarly, in another country, Japan, that is, again, ethnically very homogeneous, that's where the main concerns really came to us. We got to know that bullying was a problem in Japan before we realized it's a problem in the United States. So what happens in these homogeneous countries is that any deviation from that norm, what kids look like, how kids act, is likely to have severe consequences. And this is very interesting in places like California today, where we have much more heterogeneity, and I'll come back to that by the end of the talk. But what's really critical to understand that there are risk factors that place kids at a higher chance of getting picked on in the first place. But what predicts continued or repeated bullying are different things. And that really has to do with how the kid is reacting to being bullied. And there are two reactions that we know are particularly maladaptive. Maladaptive in the sense that that places them at higher risk for continued victimization. One is showing the hurt, the kids who start crying or look overtly distressed right then and there, and those kids who blow up. They try to retaliate, but they are ineffective, and in fact, both of these reactions, think about it, what do? They signal to the bully that he or she was effective in intimidating, And it turns out, like you saw in the little video clip, that somehow the bystanders find it amusing when kids react in these ways. Now, what's the most challenging problem with bullying? Because these victims remain as the quiet kids who suffer in silence. They don't talk about their plight. And because if they don't talk about their plight, it's very, very difficult to intervene. And what we have is these kinds of sequences where we have the maybe somewhat timid, withdrawn child who doesn't have any friends, who gets bullied, and as they get bullied, they become even more so. They are more withdrawn, they are less likely to join in other kids because they are so afraid of getting ridiculed. And when this escalates to a point, the kids certainly don't want to come to that setting where it's happening, and often in school. Or they come to school, but they're reluctant to raise their hand because they are so afraid that somebody will laugh at them no matter what they say. Now, another thing that what we learned is really critical to try to understand from the psychology perspective, which is the plight of the victim in as much as they come to really feel very alone. They think they are the only ones who get picked on, and moreover, they come to believe that that's their fault. It's something about me, I can't do anything about it, and that's what brings them down. That's when they get really depressed. And I've been to a number of conferences now when I've heard the parents of the kids who committed suicides because they were bullied talk about their kids' lives. And truly that so well demonstrates that these kids thought there's nothing that could help them any longer. They came to the conclusion that violence was the only way to end it all. So what are some misconceptions about victims of bullying? And you know what, I want to remind you of one thing, that I'm going to be referring to victims and bullies, but I'm really resentful about the terminology. I do not want you to think that we can really think about victims and bullies as some sort of permanent personality characteristics. But these are fluid, in part, fluid social roles that kids end up having. But having said that, so the kids who often get bullied, what do we know about them? Well, one misconception out there is that bullying experiences actually build character. Almost any time I talk to a parent group out in the community, some parent believes in this. It's actually good for kids. It makes them tougher. Well, we've shown it over and over again that the kids who get repeatedly bullied, their skin doesn't get any thicker, it gets thinner. They are more anxious, they are more vulnerable. It does not help them. The other misconception was promoted by the media, and this started in the late 1990s with the school shooting incidents. It was often documented that these kids who turned violent against others, they had been bullied. But what we have to remember is the statistics. This is really, really, really rare. Whereas most of the bullied kids, they suffer in silence. They're quiet. They don't turn into violent perpetrators. And then a third one I wanted to bring up regarding cyberbullying is that now we believe that cyberbullying is a particularly dangerous form of bullying because it's anonymous. Well, it turns out, so far what we know about the cyberbullying out there is that it's more of a continuation of whatever happens in school. So these are not two different things. What happens after school at night via text messaging or on the computer screen, and what happens at school. And I'll show you some data regarding that. We did a very large national study survey, web-based survey, and what we discovered is that if the participants reported that they were bullied at school, they were 7 times more likely to have experienced cyberbullying repeatedly. Now, obviously, there were other predictors as well, but nowhere close to how powerful the school bullying was. Time spent online, and in the old days when we were talking about cyberbullying being mainly computer-mediated aggression, then we also discovered that it was that the computer in the bedroom was the worst thing. Today we are in a very, very difficult situation where kids have cell phones and they do their Facebooking, we use our phones in ways that are more alike the computer than not, and that is a very private device. So again, how to best try to deal with that, given that we don't know what kind of messages kids are sending and or receiving, is a challenge for us. Now, is cyberbullying anonymous? Of these participants, 2/3 who had been cyberbullied said that they were either totally sure or pretty sure of who the perpetrator was. So the bullies may think that they are anonymous, but those who they target believe they know fairly well who they are. And what are the effects, psychological effects of cyberbullying? It turns out to be they look very similar to any other kind of bullying. That is, it's likely to feel more anxious and more depressed. Now, I'm going to leave the victims of bullying and turn to bullying behavior. Now, the power of bullying. What am I talking about? Well, this was a finding that received quite a bit of media attention a while back, when we discovered that in the beginning of middle school, the bullies were actually considered popular and cool, whereas the victims were very uncool, and the kids who were directly uninvolved in these situations, they were somewhere in between. So the relative hierarchy is very clear. The bullies are very popular, at least in the beginning of middle school. So what are some myths and facts about bullies? Well, one was that bullies are these social isolates. And what we and others have shown is that bullies, starting probably at least in the upper grades of elementary school and thereafter, they are frequently considered high status. They are socially prominent, cool, popular. They have a lot of power, and again, they use their power in various ways to their advantage. Another misconception out there, and it's still alive in part, but nowhere as close as it was, let's say 10 years ago. We thought that kids do these mean things to one another because they suffer from low self-esteem. Well, here are the findings. Bullies actually often have inflated self-esteem. They feel really great about themselves. Now, that's no coincidence, because you see this especially when the bullies are considered cool. So what do we know about young adolescents? The most important source of self-esteem is what? Peer approval. So no wonder they feel great about themselves. They get this kind of social feedback. They are respected by the rest of the kids. And finally, another misconception that was well and alive, and where this really showed was that this idea about bullies do these mean things because they don't know better, they lack social skills, was that we had a whole host of social skills interventions for bullies. Well, it turns out that bullies can be extremely socially skillful. And in fact, to the point that often it came as a total surprise to some teachers that some of the kids who they perceived as the leaders, as the top-notch students, ended up being the bullies. So again, very, they can use their social skills to be deceptive in very clever ways. Now, why do kids bully? So the best evidence that we have so far is that bullying is a way to feel in control, to demonstrate one's might. And it is the reaction of the victim, particularly the two, showing the hurt and or really blowing up, and or the lack of bystander resistance that are the proof of the power that the bully has. So what do we know about bullying? When does it peak? I already told you that it's highly prevalent and particularly problematic in middle school. But now I want to put it in a larger context. So when you think about that middle school transition, and there are others too, where kids simply are in a place where they desire to feel more in control, more in power. So what we're currently thinking is that it's really what's happening here is any social transition when relationships are interrupted are likely to make kids feel like they are powerless. They are not in control. So we have data on school transitions, and what we think is going on there is that when so many kids feel so uncertain, there's something helpful about having that social hierarchy, that pecking order, where you figure out where you fit in, and that helps kids navigate through the complex social system. And when we combine it with kids going to a school that is much larger and probably much less structured, you can understand that the social pecking order can serve a purpose. But we also have heard, I have heard from clinicians a lot about other kinds of transitions. Specifically about family transitions. That is, anytime there's a change in the family composition, for example, parents get divorced, there's remarriage, the family moves to a new neighborhood, that is a time where the existing alliances and relationships need to be renegotiated. That's when kids are often feeling that they lack power. So I'm going to show you not only about rates of bullying, but about this coolness of bullying, what we have. So here, as you can see, we have grades 4th to 8th on the x-axis. And when these are actually much like the schools here in Santa Monica, grades 4 and 5 are still in elementary school, and then they make the jump to middle school. These are correlation coefficients between kids being nominated as doing mean things to others, name calling, physically being aggressive, spreading rumors, and being also nominated as being cool. So the more you engage in these kinds of activities, the more likely you're considered to be cool based on these correlations, especially the first year in middle school. But when we get these kind of data, look, that these correlations between being a bully and being considered cool change this drastically from 5th grade to 6th grade. This is not biology. This is not about the person. This can't be. You know, parents of teenagers love to blame the raging hormones for a whole host of things. Raging hormones doesn't explain this. This has to be in part environmental. There's something about the environmental change that factors in when we get these kind of data. So why is bullying considered cool? So again, so we think that it's about this time where kids are uncertain about their place, when there's social reorganization. And another way to think about it is that a number of species, not only humans, but non-human primates and a whole host of other animals, it turns out, you know, they always have this social hierarchy within their groups. And the social hierarchies are formed based on aggression. The top, the leader, the socially most prominent, dominant individual is often the most powerful, physically aggressive individual. So we may have some parallels here. Now, why do we get this coming out among kids at times? That's really the question. So maybe under certain conditions, they are basically drawing on this very primitive desire to structure their social environment. Now, let me turn to the bystanders, because they are the witnesses of bullying. So what do we know about them? What we know, and what's so disheartening, is that bystanders rarely intervene. They indeed believe it's none of their business. And I'm going to show you again another segment where you see this. And please pay attention to everybody in this bus. This scene is actually looks much like the scene we saw in the evening news last spring. But other than there being a kid being bullied, remember who it was? It was the bus monitor. Now, look at the driver. And look at the faces of the other kids. So what we know is that bystanders are likely to join in bullying, or at least be a wonderful audience for the bully. They cheer, they smile, they reinforce the behavior. Well, why is that? It is not because kids morally accept this behavior. Tons and tons of studies where kids are asked about this. Do you think it's right for somebody to do this? All the kids, 90% of the kids says, absolutely not. No, I don't approve of this kind of behavior. But it shows nowhere in terms of their behavior. The moral belief is there, but they don't act on it. Now, why not? It's a powerful experience to be part of a group. That's what kids want to. They want to belong, they want to fit in. They don't want to be there as the target, but they want to be with the rest and feel powerful. And there's no question, they do it in part to protect themselves, either physically or they protect their image or social status. That is, to be lining oneself or siding with the victim makes them vulnerable and they don't want to be there. Again, this is where we think what we're learning about, and actually is very fascinating, and obviously is going to now affect the way we think about interventions. Now, what we also know about these witnesses, these bystanders, is, like I said, we speculated that they feel vulnerable. On a study where we asked kids by the end of the school day first to rate how they're feeling right now, and then we asked them to describe various events that they had experienced that day. And included were questions about, did you get bullied? Did you see somebody else get bullied? But that was embedded in a long list of events. What we documented was that on days when kids saw somebody else getting bullied, they were feeling much more anxious and they really disliked school. So then you can imagine when this happens repeatedly, what the cumulative effects are over time. Now, just like I showed you the coolness of bullying, what do we know about coolness of defending? Interesting parallel. In elementary school, still cool to try to defend somebody, to side with the victim. But by middle school, these correlation coefficients are non-significant, show the defenders are not gaining in social status. So what is the role of the bystanders? When we have had a chance to look at actual data from the playground, which my Canadian colleagues were able to get, they had cameras all over the schoolyard and the school building. They were able to show that when somebody, another kid intervened, bullying stopped within seconds. So the rare event is incredibly powerful. So what is our goal? What should be our goal? That how can we make more kids do that? How can we make the bystanders feel like upstanders? How can we accomplish this? Okay, now I want you to think about that power imbalance and see how the power changes in this situation. The way the first girl put the bottle on the table, that is very revealing, isn't it? So, there's strength in numbers. Okay, so now as I go to the intervention approaches, I'm going to ask you, do you think we can stop bullying, to eliminate it? No. I agree. Now, can we decrease bullying behavior? Absolutely we can. Can we diminish the emotional hurt of the victims? Absolutely we can. I feel a little bit like the presidential candidates here. Yes, we can. We can. Now what works? So here are some popular intervention approaches. You've seen these, you hear about these. Zero tolerance. One incident of bullying and you're out of here. You're expelled. Peer mediation. Let kids learn how to intervene with these incidents. Let them be the mediators. Group intervention for bullies. Identify the kids who repeatedly engage in bullying, bring them to an intervention, and teach them about anger management, teach them maybe some social skills, whatnot. Support group for victims. Identify the victims and try to run a counseling session. Okay, let's take some votes. Who thinks zero tolerance policies is the answer? Okay. Peer mediation. C, group intervention for bullies. D, support group for victims. All of the above? Wow, that was the big winner. None of the above? Okay, guess what? 1, 2, 3, I think it was 4. I'm the 5th. Probably none of the above. Okay, so let's talk about it. Why zero tolerance does not work? Zero tolerance doesn't teach kids anything. You punish, you're out, you miss the opportunity to learn. Moreover, what we know about this tactic, it predominantly targets ethnic minority youth, and it creates a very controlling climate in the school. Doesn't work. Peer mediation, tricky, very, very tricky. Why would we assume that kids can mediate something that we as adults have such hard time doing? It's a nice idea, but really, really difficult to accomplish. And moreover, what have we learned is that in some cases, it's the teachers who pick who the mediators are. And guess what? Sometimes those are the kids who are the bullies. Because they are these very Machiavellian, very socially skillful individuals who teachers like. Group intervention for bullies. What happens when you get a whole bunch of kids together in a room who have behavior problems? Ha ha. Right, that's exactly what happens. You get them to come in and brag about all the bad things they've done and are doing, and everybody else is laughing, and they are just getting new ideas how to be mean, how to hurt somebody's feelings, and the others are laughing. It's very rewarding experience when you share. And interesting enough, that is exactly the problem in prisons. Again, I'm not saying that if you have a very skilled leader and a very theoretically grounded program, you couldn't run a program for bullies. I'm saying most of the time that may actually backfire rather than help. Support group of victims. You know that depression is associated with rumination, right? Thinking about all the awful things that could happen to me, what might happen, and if that happens, and people feel overwhelmed because of that. What happens in support groups, unless, again, you have any really, really skillful leader, is you can now have kids starting to co-ruminate. Oh, I never thought about that. That could be happening too. So you get now reinforcement in a similar way, but regarding a very different process. So each of these very popular methods is associated with problems. Also, what we know about all of the above is that sometimes when you really stop it, you have a lot of different things going on at the same time. That is not an effective way to do it because it turns out most of the time you don't do any one of those really well. So what are the alternatives? Let's go back to the two questions where we can make a difference. One is to reduce the bullying behaviors. So what do we know? Based on research, what works? There's no question that, especially when we talk about overt kinds of bullying, increased supervision helps. And what sometimes happens is schools, the principal, a really good principal, figures out a map, a school map, where kids can mark what the hot spots are. And that's where you can increase supervision. And it helps. And it helps especially because, for some kids, starting in middle school, they never go to the bathroom during the school day because it's so dangerous. They know they can't afford it. parent meetings. And what this really is about the consistency across settings. That is, it doesn't help much if the school has a wonderful kind of a plan how to deal with bullying. They have their own lingo, terminology, everybody's on board if something doesn't get reinforced at home. So we need these parent meetings where parents get educated and they know about what the school is trying to accomplish and how. Consistent consequences. So again, what we know about bullying behaviors and kids, adolescents in particular, sometimes that the typical punishment tactics might not really work. Kids, for example, who are suspended from school, that's a kind of another bragging right, you know. Whereas when they lose privileges, to something might work a little better. But the bottom line here is consistency. You can't be just having consequences every fifth time because the kids know that they can get away with it. So another very different approach is this whole school anti-bullying approach where the role of the bystanders is critical. And I will come back to this after the next slide because I want to emphasize this. This has received very little attention. So if we can't totally eliminate bullying, is there a way that we can decrease their level of distress? What would help them? Well, first of all, it is about this bystander support. That is that we need to try to convince the other kids that bullying is everybody's business. That bullying is not a problem of individual kids, but it is a collective challenge. The realization that it's not just me is really important. And that's where we can rely on things like maybe attribution retraining, where kids come to see that this isn't something about me that I can't control, but I can actually get some skills where it helps. And skills are not easily taught by adults. The most natural way that kids learn social skills is from one another. So it is this one friend, and it's really remarkable. It's truly just one. One is enough. What does it do? It protects kids against bullying in the first place, and moreover, it protects them from the distress associated with being bullied. Very powerful. Okay, so now you can think about wanting to decrease the bullying behavior, wanting to alleviate the distress of the victim, but we still have this collective challenge. And it's really about how to change the pro-bully norms. So how do we do that? One is awareness training. Young kids don't have the perspective-taking skills yet, so we have to teach them those skills, what it feels to be a victim, when it feels that you're alone, when there's nobody there for you to support you. And they really can learn. But older kids who are capable of this don't resort to it necessarily. Why? Because we know that adolescents are very self-centered. It's all about me. It's not that they couldn't do this, but we need to help them engage in that perspective taking so that they can understand not only the plight of victims, but understand that they play a role. One of the ways that you can do it is you can show them tapes like this where you say, look at the bystanders. What's their role in all of this? You need to think about coping and behavioral skills as something that can be instructed. So kids do benefit from some overt, explicit teaching. And the kids who are most vulnerable, they probably would benefit the most. But don't think that confidence is something that you can boost without teaching kids skills. You know, self-esteem programs used to be really hot in schools, we used to think that low self-esteem explains a whole host of issues, including low achievement. And so what was the remedy? To have self-esteem programs. Well, self-esteem does very little good to you unless you have the skill that makes you realize that you indeed are good at something. And then, again, this follow-through and mediation of incidents. So what does it mean in the context of schools? Probably that there's a point person. Interesting enough, it doesn't have to be a teacher. It could be the school nurse. It could be the librarian. But there is a safe person, safe corner in the school environment that kids can go to when they so need. So the bottom line here is relationships matter. Again, just to summarize, the power of one friend, only one adult, that's all we need that the kids feel comfortable going to. And parental involvement. We know all of this is much more likely in smaller schools. So this is the list of these protective factors that we need to understand. And then the very final bit, ethnically diverse schools. Very quickly, because I want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions. So my colleague Sandra Graham in the education school at UCLA and I, and many of our grad students and many of our undergrads, we've been doing research in LA public middle schools for years now. And what we were really interested in, and what we still are very interested in, is what difference does it make if we have a school like this? Lots of different ethnic groups represented, and no one ethnic group is in clear majority necessarily. So in other words, how do kids feel in these kinds of schools as opposed to these kinds of schools? And to our surprise, we did not anticipate it, but the more diverse the classrooms were our African American and Latino kids were attending. And now I'm talking about these two ethnic groups only because those were the two ethnic groups that we had well represented in all of our schools and across 88 classrooms. So what did we find? Is that the kids in these kinds of settings felt safer, less bullied, less lonely, less socially anxious. Now, in these kind of settings, who do you think would be worse off when they get bullied? The purple kids or the blue kids?